Good morning, everybody, and welcome back. Hope you enjoyed your break. So I'm Clifton Bain, the advisor to the Peatland programme, and it's just really exciting to see the huge range of people attending. This next session is UK Peatland Strategies, the 4-country updates, and we'll be hearing from the 4 UK nations as to how their plans and activities are progressing. I'll start with, we'll hear from James Cooke from the Welsh Government, followed by Andrew Coupar and Ben Dipper from NatureScot and Scottish Government, and then Sara McGuckin from Northern Ireland Environment Agency, and finally David Hunter and Naomi Oakley from Defra and Natural England. And then we'll go into a half-hour Q&A slot. Please do submit your questions and I can pose them to the panel, and we'll finish at 12:30. There will also be a breakout room after that, room number 1, for further discussion with the panel members if they're available to talk about this topic for another half hour. So I'll now hand over to the first presentation, which will be James Cooke from the Welsh Government.
Good morning from Wales. It is a pleasure to be here today, and despite not being able to welcome you in person, I'm very pleased the conference has been able to continue in partnership with the Welsh Peatland Sustainable Management Scheme project, a fantastic initiative which I know you'll hear more about throughout the coming week. My name is James Cooke, and I am responsible for peatland policy at Welsh Government. My team, the Soil Policy and Agricultural Land Use Planning Unit, work very closely with our colleagues in Natural Resources Wales, Dr. Pete Jones and Dr. Roswen Leonard. The update has been given on behalf of the wider Welsh partnership. This is the first time I've had the privilege to speak at conference, and when I started looking through previous country updates, I noticed 2018's update ended by providing the reality check. We have a lot of ambition, but absolutely huge funding gap in terms of restoring and promoting the sustainable management of our peatlands. In other words, Wales is rich in ambition, but limited in delivery. Fortunately, I can now say that gap is beginning to close, and I come to conference hot on the heels of the launch of the Welsh National Peatland Action Programme. The benefits of healthy, functioning peatlands are well understood by everybody here today. So too is the need for action. The harder to find pieces to this puzzle are embedding peatlands across Welsh Government policy, turning policy into delivery, and communicating the issues, actions and value of peatlands to everybody who's not here today. Natural Resources Wales has designed Wales's first National Peatland Action Programme to align to the core goals of the UK Peatland Strategy. The national programme represents a significant milestone for peatland restoration and a significant investment by Welsh Government. It provides the resources, direction and coordination to begin the process of delivering against our peatland policy ambition and the UK strategy. Welsh peatlands are beginning to find themselves in a very fortunate position. As has been much publicised, the Welsh Government declared a climate emergency and a nature crisis, and peatlands have been clearly identified as a priority following the publication of the 2019 Programme for Government Annual Report, which committed to action to tackle biodiversity loss. This resulted in the ministers providing direct funding for an initial 5-year National Peatland Action Programme. The programme is now being embedded in the wider organisational climate and biodiversity strategies because of its direct relevance to the programme for government, and will come to play its part to support clean air and water priorities, as well as soil policy, by being a soil protection measure in its own right. The budget for the National Peatland Action Programme for the first 5 years is expected to be in the region of £7 million. Even before the launch, I was asked the question, why isn't Wales spending more given the scale of the challenge? And it's a good question. And it's simple. It doesn't matter how much money we throw at delivering these peatland goals. They cannot be achieved if at first we do not have the capacity to deliver them. This is why, in developing the national programme, and even before its launch, we have sought to build capacity to give the best chance of success over the next 5 years while maintaining an eye on what we'd like to achieve in the following 5 to 10 years. Behind the national programme is the Soil Evidence and Policy Group. This group facilitates joint working between Welsh Government and NRW on evidence, policy and delivery. Neither organisation could successfully deliver a programme of this type on its own. The national programme funds a dedicated national peatland team. It's vital to have this national team in place that are dedicated on the programme, and they're highly skilled with a critical mass to deliver not just the core programme but also the change we are all after. Capital funding without a structured delivery team puts at risk the hard-fought-for monies. Here we have the first 4 of 6 programme officers. Dr. Roswyn Leonard on the left, the programme manager, then Annetta Rumble, our grants and finance officer, Robert Bacon and Gareth Robert, the programme delivery officers, and next year a communications officer and a data analyst will also be recruited. Overseeing the whole programme and working closely with us here at Welsh Government is Dr. Pete Jones, the shining light behind the National Peatland Programme concept. Partner and contractor capacity to deliver is vital. Single-year short notice settlements put significant pressure on everyone, and even more so when there's only a limited contractor base for the UK. The programme will aim to build on the successful work of the Sustainable Management Scheme and try to tackle capacity issues head on. It will also re-establish the Welsh Peatland Action Group, a stakeholder group which is again vital to delivery. WG and Natural Resources Wales cannot do this alone either. Data, whether for monitoring, reporting, the Peatland Code or planning activities, is really important. This is not only tackled by the programme, but Welsh Government has commissioned some foundation work, including a condition survey, a bulk density, depth and carbon measurement survey, a new open government licence peat map and supporting evidence reviews, all to be delivered from April 2021. As Wales's first National Action Programme for peatlands, this document outlines a blueprint of action to be taken over the next 5 years and addressing 6 priority themes. These priority action themes represent areas where action is urgently needed to address both the nature crisis and the climate emergency. A suite of supporting measures aligned to these will secure the better coordination of effort, the evaluation of the effectiveness of our actions, and public engagement. The programme has a restoration target of between 600 to 800 hectares per year, and perhaps slightly higher in the first year. Reconvening and reconstituting the Welsh Peatland Action Group will be essential not just for delivery, but attracting other funding opportunities, monitoring, reporting, and shaping priorities for the future. NRW are going to invest a lot of time and effort in the Welsh Peatland Action Group to ensure it can perform these functions. NRW has already made significant block grants available to 2 national parks through their strategic allocated funding mechanism, and importantly, hope to be able to work with a wider range of partners through a future peatland grant mechanism. The Welsh Government views the National Peatland Action Programme as the main coordinating body for peat activity in Wales. This will be particularly important as Welsh Government continues CAP reform through the future Sustainable Farming Scheme and Wales's wider response and use of PES mechanisms. This is just a snapshot of the Welsh activity the national programme is very proud to be building upon. The work and contribution by each of these projects cannot be underestimated. Years of hard work and dedication by a range of people and organisations has laid the strong foundations to where we are today, often forging the way ahead when perhaps the policy has been a little slow to catch up. I know Rachel Harvey will be speaking more about this over the coming day. However, I just wanted to quickly mention some of the fabulous work the Welsh Peatland SMS project has been doing. One of those for you to look out for is the publication of the peat monitoring protocols. Another is restoring a significant amount of peatlands, which she'll talk about more, I'm sure. Seeking peatland code validations and developing a LANTRA approved training programme for practitioners with the Yorkshire Peat Partnership. We also have two significant EU Live programmes running. The New Life for Welsh Raised Bogs project has just been extended, and the Marshes and Mosses project being led by Natural England. A third project, the EU Life Transition Myers programme, has just received approval from the EU to progress their proposals onto the next stage. If approved, this would represent a £5 million project for Transition Myers on SACs over the next 5 years. There's also a Heritage Lottery funding bid in for the Lost Peatlands by Neathport Talbot Council. I know John will be speaking to you later in the conference, but I'm very pleased a Welsh Peatlands Evidence Fellowship has been awarded to Dr. Jonathan Walker of Swansea University. The department is very pleased to offer a letter of support for the application, and I'm confident this fellowship will greatly aid our ability to address evidence gaps relating to the sustainable management of Welsh peatlands. It is very exciting the Fellowship and National Peatland Action Programme are running side by side, and a core element delivering against the UK Peatland Strategy. I know John's advice and guidance will be invaluable when it comes to policy development. As he states in these slides, policy, strategies and land management practices must be informed by up-to-date and robust peatland science. So, what next for peatland policy in Wales? Cap replacement. Discussions will be taking place in the coming weeks and months on how the sustainable management of peatlands will feature in Wales's future sustainable farming scheme. The planning system. How do we ensure peatlands are fully taken into account? Extraction and use. A hot topic, I know, but one at the forefront of our minds. Burning. Addressed in part in the National Peatland Action Programme. How do we make sure the measures already in place are robust and fit? Evidence and reporting. Building our capacity, working with the Fellowship, feeding evidence into cross-cutting reporting mechanisms and building the case for continued restoration effort. The National Peatland Action Programme 5-year review, and what next for years 5 to 10. And dare I say it, organominerals. How should the National Peatland Action Programme and government policy reflect transition areas, peat forming areas and our wider approach to land use on this important soil resource? I hope my presentation provides a snapshot of where Wales is and the significant effort being made to restore and manage our peatlands. If you'd like to find out more about the National Peatland Action Programme, please visit Natural Resource Wales website and search for peat, where this document is now published. Please also keep an eye out for the reconvening of the Welsh Peatland Action Group and help support the restoration effort. And finally, we are due to host the IUCN conference in Wales in 2022, and we will all look forward to providing a very warm welcome. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So this is a double act between myself, Andrew Cooper from NatureScot, previously known to you as Scottish Natural Heritage, and Ben Dipper from Scottish Government. So I'm just going to briefly run through each of the UK Peatland Strategy objectives and give you an update on where we are with the various things. Conservation. So we can think of peatlands within designated sites, designated features, and in the wider countryside. In terms of their condition, the situation with their designated sites is that they're fairly stable. Things aren't getting much better, unfortunately, but at least they're not getting any worse. We still have issues with existing drains on site, so they're drawing water off the site more quickly than would otherwise be the case. Invasives, that's principally conifers which are seeding in from adjacent forestry plantations, and also over in the west of the country, rhododendron invading sites. Grazing and burning issues remain a bit of a challenge, to be honest, I would say across the resource, not everywhere, but widely. In the wider countryside, same issues as above, plus more in the way of the development issues, so tracks, for example, wind farms, hydro schemes, and other built development. Restoration, often associated with big projects, but also with continuing initiatives. We've had two of our big projects have finished during this past year, but other initiatives are continuing. In terms of scale, the Peatland Action Programme is our biggest restoration initiative. Peatland Action Team are also going to be giving their own presentation on Wednesday at 10:45, so please tune into that if you're interested. Been running now since 2012. And as you can see, going along the table by year, it's essentially getting bigger and bigger in terms of spend and also in terms of area covered. That's restoration works. Feasibility studies, these are where areas of land are surveyed to look at the potential for future projects, and so we can use that approach to get some in the bank, if you like, for future years. Overall spend to date, about £30 million, and round about between 20 and 25,000 hectares of restoration activity. Adaptive management, so using land as it is rather than trying to convert it into something that it isn't. In the uplands, there's been a bit of a change in sort of grazing and sporting enterprises' thoughts on drain blocking, and we're getting much more drain blocking going on there. This is probably partly because the droughts that we're getting now in spring and summer, that we actually sort of need more water on the ground rather than trying to get it drained off as quickly as possible. In the lowlands, I suggest we probably still got a bit further to go. Yes, we have some activity, but certainly a lot more could be done. Sustainable management. There can be a bit of a clash between what some consider to be sustainable management and others consider to be sustainable because it's traditional, it's been going on for a long time. Some of this comes down to distinctions between practice and objectives. I'm not going into the detail there, but it can be an issue to be addressed. Renewable energy. Renewable energy itself is clearly much more sustainable than other forms of energy production, but when it coincides with some of our peatland areas, then there can be a bit of challenge in there. Peat extraction. I think most people would consider that peat extraction is not a sustainable activity. I appreciate others think differently. But I think what I can say is that the local planning authorities are taking a much firmer view now on planning applications that come in, whether these be new applications or extensions to existing applications. Muir burn and wildfire clearly not sustainable, and ways of controlling wildfire are what we're starting to think about much more now, not putting them out, but sort of trying to prevent them from happening in the first place. Muir burn has a part to play in that, as do lots of other things. The proposed Flow Country World Heritage Site, it is very much about sustainable management. Yes, it's about habitat protection, but we really do need that to be a working, living landscape with people essentially being able to make livings out of living in that area. And nature-based solutions, well, that's all about sustainable management. Coordination. I think we're actually quite good in Scotland with our coordination. We have various groups and forums operating in this field, and we get good buy-in from a wide range of players representing different sectors. One thing I will draw a wee bit of attention to, where it says Scotland-Chile, just about a year or so ago, the Scottish Government engaged with Chile in relation to peatland issues, and we've been developing that ever since, and hopefully we'll take it quite a bit further. Chile's keen to learn from us, and there are undoubtedly things that we will be able to learn from Chile. Communication. Everybody wants to do it, everybody finds it difficult. A couple of examples from different sectors. Scottish Renewables recently produced a wind power and peatland leaflet on their website, just looking at some case studies of examples of peatland restoration and habitat management on wind farms. Scotch Whisky Association, they're proposing to produce a peat use action plan, which is good. Scotch Whisky Association or Scotch Whisky production don't actually use a lot of peat compared with, for example, horticulture, but clearly it's very important to their industry. Other examples of some really good communication that I've come across, Flows to the Future, which is now finished. We're very good at using the arts to get messages across to new audiences. And the proposed Flow Country World Heritage Site was very busy last year, just going out and meeting people in village halls, etc., but also some larger events and bringing people together. And Peatland Action we've already mentioned, and you'll be hearing more about them on Thursday. And that's it from me, so thank you, and over to Ben.
Thank you, Andrew. That's an excellent introduction to my section of the talk to provide an update on peatland restoration in Scotland. My name is Ben Dipper. I'm Head of Biodiversity and Land Quality at the Directorate for Environment and Forestry in the Scottish Government here in Edinburgh. And I just want to set the scene in terms of the current and future policy agenda within which peatland restoration is taking place in Scotland. Peat is indeed a big thing for Scotland, covering around 20% of the country, and it's estimated that around 80% of this is degraded. Now, among the Scottish Government's top priorities in policy terms are addressing the twin challenges of the climate emergency and biodiversity loss. Peatland restoration, peatlands offer nature-based solutions to both of these challenges, as well as a number of other benefits. So given the sequestration potential of peatlands in good condition, restoration of degraded peatlands is fundamentally embedded as a key delivery mechanism for Scotland to achieve its transition, a just transition to net zero by 2045. And latterly, peatland restoration has been absolutely recognised as a key plank of Scotland's post-COVID green economic recovery, offering the potential to support over 200 skilled jobs in the rural economy right across Scotland. So given all of the above, peatland restoration has certainly enjoyed a sharply increased profile with Scottish ministers in recent months and years. This slide just outlines a number of the strategy and policy documents produced either by the Scottish Government itself, setting out our approach to these issues, or produced by other organisations to which we're responding. I won't go through them all, but you'll recognise many of these in sort of chronological order, from the 2015 National Peatland Plan for Scotland through just last week to our position statement on the National Planning Framework 4 and our response to the report of the Grouse Moor Management Group, Werity report. All of these documents refer to peatlands, peatland restoration in some shape or form. So I think this slide is just to underline the complexity of the policy world within which peatland restoration sits in Scotland. In terms of funding, Scottish Government has invested over £30 million since 2012, as Andrew pointed out in his talk. And through that investment, we've achieved around about 26,000 hectares in total of peatland restoration. Now that compares to an annual target set in our 2018 climate change plan of 20,000 hectares per year. So I think the disparity between those figures underlies the scale of the challenge that we face in terms of meeting our ambitions and our targets in the climate change plan. However, in recognition of this challenge, in February this year, in our 2021 budget, we announced £20 million for restoration the current financial year, and a commitment to invest over £250 million over the coming 10 years towards a total of 250,000 hectares of restored peatland by 2030. Our climate change plan update that's due to be published next week will absolutely underline the importance of peatland restoration at a landscape scale over the coming decade. A huge opportunity, many challenges inherent in that, but peatland restoration is here to stay in Scotland, and it remains a core element of the so-called LULUCF, the land use change and the forestry sector of our climate change plan. As I just mentioned, there's a number of challenges and opportunities that we see in meeting these targets and this level of ambition. I'll just run through a few of these just now. First and foremost, funding. The amount of funding, I've mentioned some figures just there, but also the source of that funding. Now, the public purse has put forward a significant investment I've just mentioned, but the climate change plan update certainly recognises and underlines the need to bring private investment into this endeavour going forward if we're to have success. There's also issues around the duration of funding, so the distinction between the funding that's provided to undertake restoration now in the short term versus the sort of the long-term management tail costs that are attached to that restored peatland in order to keep it in a good condition and to keep the carbon that it stores locked up. And there's also a key issue around certainty for the sector of multi-year funding, multi-year investment in peatland restoration, which will help to unlock a number of other challenges. For example, the second bullet there, contractor capacity. We recognise that's a significant hurdle in the sector, with often competition between clients for contractors able to do peatland restoration works. And on the part of contractors, a low confidence to invest in the plant, the people and the skills to actually deliver peatland restoration to the scale that we need them to going forward. So I think that contractor capacity issue is fundamentally linked to the certainty and availability of forward multi-year funding. There's issues about hearts and minds. We need to raise awareness and support for peatland restoration among landowners and land managers. We need to work on attitudes and behaviours and what may be blocking landowners and managers' decisions to pursue an option for peatland restoration on their land. We recognise there's issues around economics and business finance in that, and there'll be tipping points which will persuade or dissuade them from going down the peatland restoration route. There's a challenge that we will need to face to bring better quality land into play, for example, agricultural land under crops or grass, given the increased emissions savings per hectare that such land types deliver if they're converted to peat. And that takes us into the whole debate around the future of land use policy more widely, and financial support for that, and indeed issues around financial support post-cap linked to Brexit. A huge opportunity we see in Scotland in particular is around engaging the crofting sector in peatland restoration. There's over 500,000 hectares of common grazing land in Scotland, much of which is under peat, and much of that peat is in poor condition. So there's a huge opportunity to engage a large number of crofters in this endeavour, which will offer and provide opportunities, skills, employment, and this all lines up under the Just Transition heading for Scottish Government about spreading the opportunities of achieving net zero by 2045 right across society. There's a national development plan in preparation for crofting, and peatland restoration plays a key part and has a key prominence in that. And finally here, a new development which we piloted in 2021 is the rollout of regional land use partnerships, which will determine on a sort of place-based, bottom-up, community-led basis how land in Scotland is to be used and managed going forward. And we fully expect peatland restoration to be one such land use type that comes through that mechanism. So to try and tackle some of these barriers and challenges, we are engaged in a number of activities. First and foremost here is a review of the vision for peatland restoration in Scotland and the governance mechanism. That sounds extremely dry, but essentially we are looking to establish a Scottish Government-led programme with new partners, with an efficient approach to delivering some of the horizontal functions such as training, data, branding, marketing, communications, and so on. And we're holding a summit next week, a peatland restoration summit that will be led by the Cabinet Secretary, Rosanna Cunningham, with stakeholders to explore the barriers and the challenges that they see, the stakeholders see, and how we can take those issues into account when designing a new approach for this in Scotland. We're undertaking a range of research and analysis to inform our thinking about the way forward, from mapping agricultural land, including crofting, and where that's underlain by peat, and what kind of tenure is in place around that, to inform where we need to undertake and focus peatland restoration to deliver the maximum greenhouse gas savings per hectare. We're looking at behaviours and attitudes, I touched on that previously. And we're looking at developing new indicators that shift the focus not just from hectares of peatland restored, but to the extent of greenhouse gases emissions saved from different types of peatland restoration on different types of land. And that will feed into analysis on the optimal mix of land use changes that we need to see in order to meet the envelopes, the LULUCF envelopes in the climate change plan. So a lot of thinking, a lot of work required to really dig into some of these technical, thorny questions. We're considering the creation of a peatland restoration standard for Scotland that's akin to the UK forestry standard, but obviously focused on peatland restoration. and consultation on the establishment of permitted development rights for peatland restoration has just closed, and we're working with colleagues to take that forward, and reference was made to that in the NPF 4, the National Planning Framework 4 position statement I referred to just a minute ago. However, we're acutely aware of the other side of the coin, the need to ensure that we protect and conserve existing peatlands as well as restoring those that are already degraded. There's a whole range of issues here which I'll just briefly touch on. The issue of commercial extraction of peat for horticulture, 2/3 of which is for amateur use and 1/3 for professional. There's the issue of burning on peat and indeed planning type development on peat, whether that's wind farms or housing or forestry or whatever it may be. All of these can damage existing peat, and there's a complex set of policy questions around how you address some of those issues. This NPF 4 position statement refers to a number of these and talks about Scottish Government planning colleagues' intentions to restrict peat extraction and development on peat, and indeed to support restoration through permitted development rights. So planning policy is certainly pushing in that direction. Aligned with that, in the 2019-20 programme for government, we committed to phasing out the use of horticultural peat, and in the recent programme for government, we have committed to stepping up that work and taking that forward with stakeholders and industry. So that is something you will see coming forward in due course. And finally, our response to the Grasmore Management Group, the Werity report I mentioned just now, talks about peat in the sense of bringing forward the legislation in the next Parliament to ban muirburn on peat. Thank you very much for listening. I realise that has been a bit of a gallop through, but I'm more than happy to take any questions on any of that in the panel discussion that is to follow. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you for those two speakers. So that's Wales and Scotland. And we're now going to head over to Northern Ireland with Sara McGuckin from the Northern Ireland Environment Agency.
Thank you, Clifford. Good morning, everyone. Delighted to be here this morning taking part in this week's IUCN Peatland Conference. I would like to thank IUCN for their invitation to allow us to provide an update on how Northern Ireland is planning to safeguard its peatlands. Northern Ireland is blessed with its natural landscapes and habitats and its associated species, with an array of blanket bog, raised bog and fen, many of which need our help to reach their full potential. Peatlands are an intrinsic part of our landscape, covering about 18% of Northern Ireland, making up 8% of the total UK peatland resource. Healthy bogs, as you'll be aware, provide us with a wide range of benefits and ecosystem services. And the importance of sustainable peatland management is increasingly recognised at the national and global level in light of their particular role with respect to climate change, mitigation and adaptation. This provides us with the opportunity to develop integrated and coherent policies and measures to safeguard and enhance our existing resource and address key pressures affecting peatland extent, function and condition. Our peatlands are under significant pressure, however, illustrated by the reported conservation status as unfavourable bad in the recent Article 17 report. The majority are in unfavourable condition, are degraded or modified, with 12% designated for protection. This, of course, means that our peat bogs are acting as sources of greenhouse gases instead of their potential as carbon sinks, with reduced capacity to provide nature-based solutions such as flood alleviation. The range of pressures include those associated with land management, as you can see listed on the right-hand side there, from drainage, burning, conversion to grassland, overgrazing, as well as pollution, and in particular atmospheric nitrogen deposition, which in Northern Ireland is largely from local ammonia sources from agriculture. We, of course, have the emerging impacts from climate change. So these pressures must be addressed if we are to restore and safeguard our peatlands for the future. To deliver the necessary measures, to restore and safeguard our peatlands, as set out in the UK strategy, we are taking steps across a number of fronts. We've been working to prepare a draft peatland strategy for Northern Ireland, and this will provide a framework to guide the conservation and restoration of semi-natural peatland habitats in Northern Ireland and reflect the commitments set out in the UK Peatland Strategy. It is anticipated that the draft strategy will issue for consultation early in 2021. We are working hard to maximise available funding and support for sustainable peatland management, which I'll touch on briefly shortly. And the department is also developing conservation management plans for protected peatland habitats and the rollout of targeted peatland restoration through Interreg and other means. We are working hard to improve our evidence base on extent and condition, and I'll touch on that in more detail shortly. The majority of Northern Ireland's peatlands are impacted by excessive nitrogen deposition, so we have been taking forward a programme of work to examine this impact in particular and take forward the necessary measures to address the specific pressure. As well as this, we have a number of peatland restoration programs, projects underway to establish the appropriate restoration works and provide invaluable demonstration of the value and effectiveness of these interventions. I will touch on some of these shortly. Sustainable peatland management requires the provision of appropriate targeted funding to cover the costs of capital works and the ongoing maintenance and support required by landowners to ensure that that sustainable management continues. NIA has worked closely with SEUPB, which is the special EU programme body, to draw down cross-border funding, almost €14.5 million for the restoration of peatland and wetland habitats and species, involving Northern Ireland, border counties of the Republic of Ireland and Western Scotland. This has enabled the development of conservation action plans for a suite of our peatland SECs and the rollout of targeted peatland restoration through the Interreg 5A programme in partnership with local landowners. Defra also supports remediation of peatland habitats through the environmental farming scheme through appropriate grazing, scrub removal and other conservation measures. And through the department's Environment Fund, which provides for habitat restoration and the development of management plans and will fund carbon flux measurements in the incoming year. In terms of future funding, we are now scoping the Peace Plus programme, a new EU cross-border fund to provide further investment for habitat and species restoration to build on the good work already established under Interreg 5A. In addition, officials are currently scoping a range of nature recovery initiatives, including a potential peatland restoration fund to supplement current provision and provide for more bespoke landscape scale restoration efforts. This will be designed to deliver the department's dual objectives to deliver net zero and restore biodiversity, and will support the outworking of the peatland strategy. In terms of enhancing and building our science and evidence base, we are working to use a mix of remote sensing and traditional habitat monitoring to help focus additional investment and survey work to address evidence gaps. We're working to develop a dynamic and open habitat distribution map of protected and priority habitats in partnership with JNCC through our Living Map of Northern Ireland project, which is based on methodology previously developed by Natural England. We've been working with JNCC since 2018 to develop this living map, commencing with work in County Fermanagh using Sentinel satellite data provided through the EU Copernicus programme. Our evidence team are well advanced with iterations for Fermanagh and counties Tyrone and Derry, supported by a programme of ground truthing using various condition assessment exercises to train the analytical software, with our goal to have a complete living map of Northern Ireland provided during 2021. We will be conducting specific assessment as well of bare peat areas in West Fermanagh using a combination of the Copernicus satellite data and also very high resolution commercial data during the incoming year. In terms of nitrogen deposition, we have an extensive work programme underway to understand and address the nitrogen deposition impacts, particularly on our sensitive peatland habitats, as ammonia levels and the excessive ammonia levels and nitrogen deposition loading will undermine our efforts to restore our peatlands. Our science programme to model and understand ecological impact focuses on a number of our peatland SECs involving ammonia monitoring on site and in the surrounding landscape, the development of bioindicators to better understand the longer term foliar nitrogen impacts, and modelling scenarios to reduce impact at site level. This will inform the forward management of our designated site network and increase our understanding of ecological effects caused by nitrogen deposition. It will also allow us to examine the effectiveness of restoration efforts on sites heavily impacted by nitrogen and allow us to look at the impact on carbon fluxes. The ammonia strategy, which is due to issue soon for public consultation, will be designed to deliver sustained and targeted ammonia reductions and provide for habitat restoration and protection. I touched earlier on the Interreg programme. Our two Interreg 5A projects have injected much needed energy and insight into our efforts on landscape scale peatland restoration through the preparation of conservation action plans and on-site restoration and the development of effective partnerships across a number of organisations. The CAN project shown here involves 10 such organisations which are delivering great outcomes on the ground. You will hear more about this exciting partnership project from Trish Fox of Ulster Wildlife on Wednesday. The CAB project has been delivering across a number of fronts to prepare action plans for key peatland sites and carry out restoration and conservation action for both those habitats and other priority species such as marsh fritillary, breeding waders and hen harrier. Both of these projects collaborate and share best practice on a regular basis, helping to build the expertise and experience needed to help deliver for Northern Ireland's peatlands. Here we have the Caffrey Hill Farm Forest to Bog Restoration Project. This is an exciting project that our departmental colleagues in Caffrey are leading on in partnership with Forest Service. It involves the felling and restoration of almost 60 hectares of forest on peat within the Antrim Hills SPA. The team are working to demonstrate a range of methods, but predominantly using stump flipping, ground smoothing, furrow blocking and rain blocking. As issues emerge throughout the project, the team are engaging fully with the other restoration projects, recognising that every site that's been restored brings up new issues and challenges and benefits from sharing best practice. This is also a very exciting project that we're particularly interested to see come to completion, involving forest to bog restoration at Forest Service lands at Tully Cherry Forest. This has been developed through the Source to Tap project, a water quality project also funded under Interreg 5A. This particular site was ideal for restoration, being the ideal slope, having mature trees ready for felling, and being in land immediately adjacent to Pedigo Plateau SEC, which is designated for its blanket bog and associated features. The protected area is marked there on the map as the hatched area, and while the area in red is the felled area now being restored. The CAB project, which I've also mentioned, is also preparing a conservation management plan for the Pedigo Plateau SEC. So this has been a great example of partnership working between the two Interreg projects, Forest Service and NIA. This pilot project is trialling methods to raise the water table and to reduce sediment runoff into local water courses associated with forest activity. And their objective here is to compare the method of cell bonding to the more common methods such as peat dams, and we'll be openly sharing the results of that project. So there's some great learning to come from this project, and we look forward to seeing the outcomes, including a wider continuous swathe of blanket bog contiguous to a protected site for blanket bog. So finally, to summarise, the main focus for the Northern Ireland peatland programme going forward is to issue the draft peatland strategy for consultation early in 2021. To continue,
if you can hear me.
Yep. Scoping the resilient peatland programme through pilots and funding, to put out the draft ammonia consultation soon for consultation, to build our evidence base in terms of metrics and evidence on peatlands, and to work with our colleagues to shape future agri-environment to ensure long-term sustainable management for peatlands is firmly in place. Thank you.
Sara, thank you very much for that. So we've now got, coming up next, hearing from David Hunter and Naomi Oakley for England. But before we do that, just like to remind people to submit their questions. We've had a good range of questions coming in already, and I'll encourage the speakers to have a look at those as well, because some of them are asking for information that could easily just be sent by links if you could. We're just building up for the slideshow from David shortly, so I'll just keep wittering on to fill the space. But as I say, please do have a look at the questions that are starting to come in, and we'll pose these to the panel after David and Naomi's slot.
Ready?
Should be able to hand over very shortly. So one couple of seconds, folks, bear with us, and that looks like we're ready to roll. So hand over now to David Hunter and Naomi Oakley for the England update.
Thank you, Clifton. And thanks to the IUCN for hosting today's conference. My name is David Hunter, and you'll shortly be seeing and hearing from Naomi Oakley from Natural England. Naomi is an advisor on green farming and fisheries at Natural England, and my role is as head of soils and peatlands in our recently formed division within Defra, covering landscapes, access, people, as well as soils and peatlands. So this new division that we are part of is extremely well connected and pertinent to the job that we do on a day-to-day basis. Okay, Minister Pow has already spoken about the England Peatland Strategy today, and I'd like to just extend my thanks to Minister Pow for her work and support on this, so that we can actually move the England Peat Strategy forward, and we really do hope that you'll be hearing from us on that very shortly. Today I'm going to try to provide some more detail where I can, and talk about some of the other policies that Defra are developing that will have an impact on peatland. Areas such as the Environmental Land Management Scheme, which has had a lot of attention recently with the publication of the Agricultural Transition Policy, as well as looking at some of the key aspects in the England Peat Strategy itself. I'll then hand over to Naomi Oakley from Natural England for an overview of an area of work that we began back in 2019. There was a bit of a Pathfinder project, really, to explore how best we engage with different stakeholders and communities of interest to deliver the England Peat Strategy. This work was known as the England Peat Strategy Peat Pilots. To begin with, then, I wanted to have a quick look at the Environmental Land Management Policy. It will be the main mechanism for government's funding of peat restoration from 2020. As I mentioned, the Agricultural Transition Policy, which was published just over a week ago, will set out planned changes to agricultural policy in England from the 1st of January through to 2027. Those new approaches include the new Environmental Land Management Scheme, which will pay farmers to produce public goods, grants to help improve farm productivity and prosperity, and a new approach to farming regulations and enforcement. Funding will also be provided through the protected landscape bodies to support farmers in national parks and AONBs, which we know are largely in the uplands, many farming on peat, and also land use competition and issues that exist in those environments as well. The fund will be there to help make improvements to the natural environment, cultural heritage and public access on land within those areas. That's probably as much as we can say at this stage on that, and further details as they develop will become available in 2021. The ELM scheme will fully launch in 2024, but elements of the scheme will be rolled out from 2021. And the Prime Minister's 10-point plan, which was announced a few weeks ago, introduced a new commitment to establish a number of long-term landscape recovery projects over the next 4 years, pilot land use change, and wider and restore wilder landscapes overall. These recovery projects will be delivered through the new ELM scheme, so that there's a lot to look forward to within that over the next few years. Pick up then on the England peat strategy, which, as everybody here will say, is very long awaited. Minister Pow mentioned in her address, this will be published very soon, and 2020 has not been a particularly normal year for us, within which to progress policy quickly, with the change in the ministerial team at the start of the year following the December election, flooding, and coronavirus making normal operating challenging, to say the least. But we have continued to progress things. We've been able to feed into the learning from the peat pilots. We've held 3 very helpful engagement sessions on the England peat strategy over the summer, and we were able to secure the NCF funding as part of that. And this will boost the operational arrangements within which Natural England can deliver the NCF funding over the next few years. We hope that we are going to be in a much stronger place than we were a couple of years ago when I spoke to this conference. And we have designed the strategy to follow 3 key pillars to work in the future. Restoring peatlands using the Nature for Climate Fund, which we'll come on to shortly, and setting our peatlands on a trajectory for recovery. Reducing the negative impacts on peatlands, which include launching our Lowland Agricultural Peat Task Force. More on that shortly. Finally, the strategy will also set out our plans for protecting peatlands by phasing out particularly damaging practices and protecting peat from fire. The Nature for Climate Fund was announced in the March budget by the Chancellor, a proportion of which will go forward to deliver the 35,000 hectares of peat restoration work that was announced by 20. We are setting up a competitive grant fund, which we plan to launch early next year. That will be delivered by Natural England, and colleagues in Natural England are currently working hard to gear up for that launch. We received funding for this financial year. We plan to set up our more bespoke peatland competitive scheme in 2021. Some of the funding that we had for this year was really reallocated to the Green Recovery Challenge Fund, which we know some of the people at the conference had applied for. And on Saturday, on World Soils Day, you may have seen the announcement of the chair of our new Lowland Agricultural Peat Task Force, Robert Caldwell. Robert is currently chair of the Association of Drainage Authorities. As Minister Power mentioned, we've had introductory meetings with Robert on this, and I can certainly vouch the fact that Robert will be a strong champion and will, I think, bring together all the relevant parties that we need to be working with on this Lowland Agricultural Peat agenda. And Robert, although he is in the east of England, recognises the important role of dealing with issues in lowland agricultural peat across the country. 86% of our emissions in England come from lowland agricultural peat, so it is hugely important and growing in recognition across government. So we convened the task force in January to deliver recommendations for more sustainable farming that reduces levels of greenhouse gas emissions. The task force will report to government in 2022, following 18 months of timeline on which to deliver. We are currently finalising with Robert the membership of that task force, as well as 4 sub-regional groups. Wider commitments then, the Office for Environmental Protection is one of the areas we thought we'd pick up here. The new and independent statutory body that the Environment Bill will create will contribute to the environmental protection and the improvement of the natural environment. Due to the pause that the bill was placed on because of the coronavirus pandemic, the establishment of the OEP has been somewhat delayed, but when the bill gets royal assent in the new year, we can expect the OEP to be established soon after that. I'll now hand over to Naomi Oakley to talk a bit more about the peatland pilots before wrapping up. And Naomi, if you'd just let me know when you want to change slides, and I'll change them over for you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, David. Can we have the first slide, please?
Yep.
Great, thank you. Thank you for the invitation to speak today. It's great to be here and to update you on the England Peat Strategy peat pilots. So Natural England ran 5 peat pilots across the country in 2019 to inform the delivery of the England Peat Strategy. And the idea behind that were to explore the barriers and opportunities to protect, restore and sustainably manage our peatlands. So we chose 5 diverse sites along with stakeholders and Defra to look at what the really big issues were that would be a blocker to the achievement of the amazingly pressing targets that we've got. So in brief, the Border Uplands was looking at the issue of trees and peat, particularly the tensions between the targets for the tree strategy and the peat strategy, and how we can have the right tree in the right place that's good for the landscape, it's good for carbon, it's good for people. And it's a very sort of fine balancing act, but it's definitely thinking about how just it is for people as well. And just is a word that keeps coming up through this presentation, actually, and it's really interesting that it's come up before. We also looked at the North York Moors, which was a pilot run around the restorability of peat in a very drying climate, and that's under different management regimes. And it's about restorability, and it's about the impact of management and the opportunities for peatland restoration, but also with a big thought about the impact of peatland restoration and communities that live downstream from that place. So it's not just about that individual site and the restoration there, it's about the flooding and the vulnerability of communities that live downstream. David's already mentioned Robert Caldwell, really excited to have him as the lead for the Lowland Agricultural Peat Task Force. He brings a lot of knowledge with him. He came up several times in the East Anglian Fens pilot as somebody who really knows the stuff about peat and understands the industry. East Anglia is an amazing, it's our food basket in a lot of ways. It grows a huge amount of crops, but it's very vulnerable to development, and it's got huge amounts of degradation of the peat mass there. lots of opportunities, but a lot of working at scale with lots of drainage boards and lots of imperatives from the industry pushing on businesses. There's also got some really interesting things about the Oxcam growth arc and the impact of development on the wider catchments. So really interesting strategic discussions about food security and national development as well, all coming together around the issue of peat, which is very exciting. We also looked at Greater Manchester Combined Authority area. Greater Manchester has a big conurbation. It has water flowing across the catchment on the west side of the Pennines. You've got upland areas with issues of grouse moor management that can be, and then managed burning. Then you've got wildfire issues as well. Then you come down through high areas of development pressure on peatlands, and you then come out onto the west side of Manchester where you've got peat milling on lowland bogs, got a lot of drainage, and then you've got these isolated, really important peat habitats around lowland raised bogs and the meres and mosses. So you've got, in Manchester, you've got all of these really pressing issues happening to peat, to habitat and to people, with a very keen authority, combined authority, who really want to do the right thing for climate, with their own very stringent climate change targets as well. Really interesting to see so much proactive thought coalescing around peat. That's really inspiring, actually. And then our last pilot was down on Dartmoor, common land, where land is owned by one person, but other people have property rights, contains a lot of our peat, probably because it was land that was less well drained, it was wetter, it wasn't as valuable for enclosure. So you end up with a large concentration, particularly of blanket bog on commons. And this happens across the whole of the uplands of England. And those people, commoners, have rights of property that are indivisible from the land. You know, you can't take that away from them. And people need to they need to be engaged with peatland restoration, and they need to make it feel important to them, and that they are a part of that change when peatland is restored on their common. Can we flip to the next slide, please, David? So at the same time as the peat pilots, we also had the social barriers and opportunities project that we ran with Newcastle University, on several universities, actually. You can see then all the people that were involved. It was led by Mark Reed. And if you want to look at it, it's on the Newcastle University publications list. It was a really, really interesting study for me. It was looking at the people and what stops people engaging, and the importance of looking at the external factors that make people just make their decisions. So why do farmers and commoners and land managers and estate owners, why do they do what they do? It's around their tenure, it's around their business, and those are all the external things, but there are also the massively important internal factors around money, risk perception, and those things can act as barriers or enablers, depending on how we spin them, to the delivery of policy objectives. So basically it's saying that if you want to understand the internal influences that shape favourable attitudes towards policy mechanisms, it's saying, what do we have to say to people to make them engage and want to do the right thing for peat? And these insights can then be used to tailor the design and a communication to engender a more positive engagement with the England Peat Strategy and Nature for Climate Fund, and all of those things that we need people to engage with and to want to be part of. So the research followed a mixed methods design, combining insights from the qualitative interviews with all the people in those 5 pilot areas, looking at, so they did interviews, And there was also a photo survey to engender and see what people were really interested in their peatlands of their areas. And there was also a systematic evidence review as well, which was quite unusual and is really interesting. I really encourage people to download the report and to have a look at it. And this slide shows Helen Radmore. She's one of our interviewees from Dartmoor, and she was violently opposed to, table-smackingly opposed to peatland restoration because of the impact it would have on our animals. And by the end of the conversations with the guys from Newcastle, she felt engaged, and she felt that it was special and it was really important that she thought about peatlands for the future. And I was really impressed that it was those conversations with people from outside that made such a huge difference to her. And it was that whole thing of justice. She felt heard and she felt important. And I think the wordle, which is part of the findings from the report, it's how big, each one of these are taken from people's interviews, and they keep saying people, every one of them, people are at the heart of, people's responses. And it's that desire for people to have their voices heard and then to engage them and to make them part of that delivery of policy. And, people make policy is actually, they're the ones that make it happen, and they're the ones that are so important. So I'd encourage you to download the report. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you, Clifton.
Thank you. So, a big thank you to all our speakers. And we're now going to be heading into the Q&A session and looking at the questions that have come through. There's a fantastic range of them. What I'll do is I'll try and capture them in a couple of key headings and pose them to the panel. Looking across the questions that have come in, obviously many of you, the audience, should be able to see those as well. There's probably about a handful of key themes. The first being the sort of recognition that this strategic work and the plans across the countries is really important. And I have to say personally, over the last 10 years or so, that is the thing. These building blocks, the foundations for policy, decision-making, and the release of funding, it's incredible. That's what peatlands needed. In addition, and that's what this conference is being focused on, how do we actually deliver these plans and strategies? It's worth saying that across the world, what we've achieved so far, even though we haven't completed the job of all the plans, is still world leading. And there's a lot of countries now embarking on their peatland work and looking for help and advice from the UK in the way that it's developed its strategies. So it's important stuff. I think there's a question there about sharing experience across the 4 countries. Perhaps I can just answer that myself. The principal, one of the key areas of work of the IUCN UK Peatland programme is that there's an opportunity for the 4 countries, not least this regular slot in our conference, but also separate meetings where the 4 countries can get together and share experience. And I think that's incredibly valuable. And we may need to be looking as well beyond the UK as more countries across Europe and the rest of the world start showing interest in sharing experience. In terms of the big policy issues, there's a few questions around, are we being ambitious enough and are we delivering fast enough to meet the global crises of biodiversity, climate change, and to meet the net zero targets? And I might, I'll come back to the panel on that question. The second thing is in relation to, are we dealing, whilst we're doing a lot of effort on restoration, are we dealing with the counter side, the threats? Are we measuring the impact of the damaging developments that are still taking place? Are we dealing with the threats of other legitimate climate activity like wind farms and tree planting? Are we managing these three things effectively? The big threat that people are talking about is clearly horticulture. Why are we still talking about phasing out and not just having a ban? The third one, very important one raised by a couple of the speakers as well, capacity to deliver, building the capacity, not least amongst the contractors, but having trained people who understand peatlands and land managers able to go forward. And a good point raised as well about, have we got the next generation of peatland restorers and contractors being trained up? And there was a point about, which the ministers raised, about the opportunities post-COVID for a growth, employment in this whole sector, and we need to look at that. The next issue was around looking beyond just the deep peats. I think the whole question of organomineral soils and where do we go to these perhaps shallower peatland types that many still have biodiversity interests, but there's certainly a sort of key carbon issue. Monitoring and reporting, there's quite a lot of the questions have around, are we monitoring progress? How we put the resources in to monitor our progress? Are we monitoring and quantifying the benefits of peatlands so that we can help justify all this spend? And related to that, have we got the scientific evidence being invested in so that we can make smarter policy decisions in relation to moorland management, burning, tree planting, the effects of wind farms on peatlands, all of these things? What's the biodiversity benefit of peatland restoration? Still needing the scientific evidence alongside that monitoring and reporting. And perhaps the final one I'll touch on now is the hearts and mind, and Naomi picked on that perfectly. The bringing people along. Are we doing enough to change behaviour, whether it's peat in horticulture, to bringing on land managers to support the vision for peatlands, and encouraging people to recognise the benefits. So that seems to be the sort of gist of many of the questions. I'll start with the panel. So the first question around perhaps the goals and targets within the strategies. Are we being ambitious enough? Is what's being proposed going to get us to the goals, particularly around climate change and biodiversity? And how, perhaps tied with that, how are we looking at the capacity to deliver, getting the contractors, young people trained? So I'm going to start, if this works, I'm just going to go one by one through the panel, quick short answers if you can. So perhaps starting with Ben. So the question around, are we being ambitious enough, and are we spending enough, and are we building up the delivery enough?
Thank you, Clifton, and good afternoon, everybody. Happy to be on the panel here to continue this discussion. Are we being ambitious enough? I think we certainly have a high ambition. I mean, I talked in my presentation about the current targets we have in our climate change plan from 2018 of 20,000 hectares a year, and that's very much tied into the sort of sectoral envelope approach we have in the climate change plan in Scotland. So it's very much tied into raising the amount of sequestration that the peatlands can deliver us in Scotland, and it's all sort of tied into the journey to net zero. So the ambition is absolutely there, and as I mentioned, we're publishing an update to our 2018 climate change plan next week, which will fundamentally underline those ambitions and the place of peatland restoration going forward as we sort of evolve our view of how we will achieve net zero by 2045. So the ambition is there. Certainly for Scotland, the funding is there at the moment to match that ambition. And obviously, these things will be under constant review as we move forward on sort of decadal timeframe. In terms of the capacity to deliver and the mechanisms to deliver, I mentioned in my talk that we're undertaking a review of the governance of peatland restoration in Scotland at the moment. The summit that we're holding next week will absolutely inform our thinking about the best framework, the best sort of mechanism to deliver and support and fund peatland restoration going forward. We recognise many of the challenges that have been raised around, for example, multi-year funding, around contractor capacity, around training, around awareness. And the idea of the Peatland Summit is to really, I think, inform and confirm a lot of the issues that we're aware of, so that we can build those into discussions that we'll have with the delivery partners sort of early in the new year, to develop a new Scottish Government-led programme. So, you know, the ambition is huge, the opportunity is huge. You know, I suspect if anything, it's only going to grow moving forward. So, you know, we're working hard, I think, to address some of these sort of systemic challenges that we see in the activity, and putting public funding into it. But as I said, also recognise the need really to bring private funding into this as well. The public purse can't do all this, and you know, mechanisms like the Peatland Code, I think, will be essential going forward to try and leverage some of that additional funding into this activity. There's a huge amount in the question. That's probably a real gallop through some of the answers. You know, happy to take this at whatever pace people want to, in whatever form they want to.
Thank you, Ben. I'll perhaps then go over to Sarah, or sorry, yes, Sarah. Same question.
Okay. Well, I think we maybe just have the ambition maybe just right, because it still will be challenging to meet the targets and the goals that have been set, but also appreciating that I suppose the areas that we're particularly interested in have other uses and other users who have worked those lands and maybe have their own plans for them. So I think we need to have a measured approach so that we can bring landowners with us, and ensure that the other policy drivers and supports that come along with that will help us get, I suppose, in particular parts of the landscape, get those landowners engaged, and also use that time to build the capacity and the resource. So I think there's an awful lot of complementary and parallel strands that need to come alongside this. So I think we'll have our work cut out for us.
Thank you, Sarah. And that's an important point about running the delivery and ambitions alongside, which is something that James raised at the start. James, over to you as well. Same question.
Thank you, Clifton. And I just very much agree with my two colleagues who have already spoken on it. I think it's key to recognise that we're not starting from zero here with what we're doing. We are building on years of experience and millions of pounds of investment already through programmes like Sustainable Management Scheme and EU Life funding. And, you know, it's not just government who are delivering this. It's going to be all of us, all our stakeholders, putting the action and resources in place to deliver our ambitions. So, you know, for Wales, we are behind Scotland, make no bones about that, but it is about building capacity. And that's going to be the key for us to ramp up the scale of delivery to meet the ambition long term. We could pump in £250 million right now. I wouldn't be able to spend it and I have to hand it all back to the Treasury. So that capacity building is key. And just as two examples, NLW have to put a grants mechanism in place to get the monies out to our partner organisations across the country. That is no easy task. And NLW have to put in place, which we've just done actually, a multi-year, multi-million procurement framework. Those take time to deliver and put in place. So plenty of ambition and hopefully building capacity to get there, deliver at scale in future years.
Thanks, James. David, I'm going to adjust the question for you. There's obviously ambitions with the England Peatland Strategy for, is it around 35,000 hectares of peatland restoration. We should be hearing in the next couple of days the Committee on Climate Change 6th budget, and I get the impression that they're going to be ramping up their advice for the amount of restoration that we need to deliver urgently. Perhaps then in that context, where do you see your current target and how quickly can that be exceeded? And then the sub-question on this is the pace in the horticultural world to getting peatland and peat products banned, there's obviously a desire from the questions to speed that element up. What are your thoughts there, David?
Thanks, Clifton. I think just overall, the challenge here is that meeting the peatland restoration targets overall and the meeting targets towards net zero is a bit of a long game. In the great scheme of things, it's not if you're looking at 2045, 2050 sort of thing. But we can't afford to sell it like a long game in that sense. And it has to be something that we make sure that the strategy and all the messages that we send to government are all about the imperative now. I think that can only really be helped in many ways by the direction which the Committee for Climate Change is actually pushing. And whilst that is challenging, there is a slight sort of parallax there in terms of what they're saying and where we are with policy currently. I think the 35,000 hectare ambition in terms of peatland restoration up to 2025 is, for all the reasons that have been articulated, not least very well there by James, is something that is a big step forward in the short term. We need to try and make that as concrete as possible within the framework of the Nature for Climate Fund, so that we actually do get a positive reaction from the sector, so that contractors are able to invest and have confidence in the fact that there is funding that will be available to meet that target. I think in the longer term, we are looking to a number of measures, such as the Environmental Land Management Scheme that we talked about earlier, actually picking up from where we leave off with the Nature for Climate Fund. And it's fundamental there that has a major role to play in transforming landscapes beyond this initial 35,000 hectares that we're looking at. But I think certainly the way that we've tried to predict where we need to get to, we've pushed on our targets over the longer term to try and ensure that we are putting pressure on those numbers. I think there's very interesting situations across the 4 countries in terms of where there are different pressures, there are different political structures and different land ownership tenures to take into account as part of that. So whilst we want to have a sort of UK-wide picture, it's actually quite challenging, I think. And that's what's good about having this kind of approach here with 4 different reports back on that. The discussions on horticulture have been really useful of late. We had a good session with the horticulture industry recently, and one of the things that came up there was the issue of product replacement. And actually, as much as we need to end damaging practices, we need to look at where we can support alternatives, and as you mentioned earlier, get the messaging right on alternatives. We don't want to export the problem elsewhere. And we also recognise that some of the technologies and some of the alternatives are still at burgeoning stages, and so we need to really look at how we could help bring those forward at the same time as trying to reduce the amount of peat that is being extracted still. The only other thing I wanted to come back to, if you don't mind, Clifton, was at the very start of your conversation, you talked about strategic work and the international importance of that. And one of the areas that within our division that I mentioned earlier that we manage is an initiative called Darwin Plus that will have more funding going into overseas territories for projects, and particularly those kind of projects which relate to peatland restoration. So we're really looking forward to being able to expand that side of things, as well as obviously looking at how we deliver against targets in England.
Thank you, David. That's great. And it's worth just saying on the overseas territories that places like the Falklands, key peatland areas, and they're very keen to start developing strategies and equivalents to the peatland code. Right, in the time left, I'm going to just split the questions into 2 groups. The first one being the capacity for monitoring, reporting and gathering evidence short answers, starting perhaps with, let's hear from Andrew Cooper. Are we putting in place enough resources to enable monitoring and reporting against our goals and building our evidence base? What do you think, Andrew?
Are we putting enough, irrespective of how much we were putting in? I suspect we wouldn't be putting in enough, or some people would think we weren't putting in enough. A more direct answer, no, we're probably not. There is so much information that we need to gather to make good decisions. I think it's probably fair to say that is a part of the jigsaw that's a little under-resourced at the moment. And I could just leave it like that if you want to keep it short and go around the houses.
Thank you. I'll turn then to David. You know, the experience of the England Peatland Strategy, how hard has it been to get the information you need to allow you to monitor progress against the goals? And what do you think are the big solutions that you can put in play?
I think it is quite challenging to understand that picture overall. We're also under pressure at the same time. You have seen recently where there have been incidences of peat soils being planted on, for example, and largely when you look at incidences like that, it does come down to the available data that's there and good mapping to allow us to actually make the case for protecting areas. And so as part of the Nature for Climate Fund, we've identified £3 million over the next 2 years to map our peatlands so that we have that picture. We can use that as our basis on which to make decisions. Not only that, we also need to look at how guidance and best practice helps to make those decisions as well. So as much as having the information that we can monitor it by, some of the tools that we also need, such as guidance, needs to be in place. I think, yeah, we can always do with more. And I think in the context of monitoring, part of the job here is to actually not only identify what we're spending the money on, but as part of the Peatland Code, make sure that we can identify through activities like that that show where peatland restoration is happening. I think it's a very complicated, knotty picture in England, given that extent of challenges across different environments, land ownership, and other pressures that are on land that make it quite challenging to know that. I think the fundamental part of that, however, is mapping and making sure that we have that investment there, which has been at the foremost of our mind when we'll be developing our strategies, that we need that evidence up front, and that's why we're investing.
Thanks, David. Naomi had her hand up. If Naomi, you could follow on, but also could you just quickly answer the issue about changing hearts and minds? You've obviously done a lot of work around this. Just maybe make sure that people are aware of where the data is around the attitude surveys and the peatland pilots, because that's coming.
Okay, so something I just wanted to chip in is Natural England are working on the design of the Nature for Climate Fund for peatlands, and monitoring and evaluation has been built into that from the beginning. And I think that is a really important thing for us to take forward into ELMS as well. It's not something you should tack on at the end as an afterthought. It should be built in from the very start of any funding mechanism. Seems really important to us. And the Newcastle University publication, the Social Opportunities and Barriers work, just Google it, but it's also linked off the publications page of the university.
Thank you.
And if you still can't find it, then email me at Natural England and I'll send you a copy.
Great. We've got 2 minutes left. We will carry forward the discussion in the breakout session, but I just want to give James and Sarah a last word around perhaps monitoring and survey and what you think can be done to help you monitor progress as well as benefits. James.
Yeah, thank you. It's vital. One of the big problems we had when we were beginning on the National Peatland Action Programme was the lack of data availability. So partly that's redesigning the peat map for Wales. It's making sure that it's open government licence, so everybody can access it, and the base data, so they can have confidence in it and know where the weaknesses are. And we've also commissioned relatively small scale, but starting condition survey for some of our priority sites, as well as the depth, bulk density and carbon measurement survey. And Natural Resources Wales are putting in place, hopefully, a peatland data portal where the map will feature, and as restoration happens through the programme, that data is fed back into the portal, and that can be updated in a timely fashion so we can monitor what we're doing. But it's also important for justifying the funds that we're spending and making the case for more funds and a greater, and meet the ambition as we move forward. So it plays both, and it's working with our colleagues in England, Scotland and Northern Ireland, as well as JNCC and the IUCN as well.
Sarah, for Northern Ireland, what's been your thoughts?
Well, this is quite interesting. It came up as part of the discussion in the recent Natural Capital Finance and Investment Conference, where they were looking at how we can draw in private finance to support public funding for nature restoration. And primarily peatland restoration springs to mind because it ticks all the offsetting boxes as well, and that need for clearer metrics and some certainty around the environmental outcomes from any such investment seem to be important for the sector. But I think there was a recognition that the natural environment we can't measure every single aspect of it, and that as long as we can work together across these organisations here to agree what I suppose a common standard or the minimum metrics that we need to be gathering, because we all have a series of restoration projects ongoing. Have we set out a clear format and framework for the project owners to actually report against? And I think if we could do that, we could do it much more efficiently. We don't have to measure everything, but I think if we could agree what the key indicators are, that would help us with that investment, and also ensure that we gather the right information to make the case for further finance.
Thank you, Sarah. And I think that's an important point for carrying forward into the next few days, the development of some sort of common approach, common standards, baseline standards for monitoring, so that we can coordinate, and a repository for the information. And Mark Reid, I'm sure, will be able to update us on some of the work around that, because this is also being discussed globally, and we'll hear in this afternoon's sessions what some of the Global Peatlands Initiative is trying to do along those lines of common standards and indeed mapping as well. I'm going to thank the panel now. That's us come to the end. That's really helpful, and I hope it sets the tone for, or the scene for the coming days. We've got an immense array of really good policy and goals being developed. More work to be done in certain areas, quite clearly, but let the discussion now in the rest of the conference go on to how we actually keep expanding on these policies and putting work into practice. And my phone has just started ringing, so a good time for me to shut up. Thank you, folks. Bye, and we'll see you in the breakout rooms.